You and that child are nothing to me!
End his entire empire, right now. You are completely finished.
This is a work of complete fiction created solely for entertainment purposes. All characters, organizations, events, and locations are entirely invented. Any resemblance to real persons or real events is coincidental and unintended. He smeared birthday cake across his pregnant wife's face in front of 200 people and then straightened his jacket. That was it. No pause. No flicker of regret. Adrian Vaughn simply reached into the 5-tier cake his assistant had spent 3 weeks arranging, scooped a fistful of white frosting and dark chocolate sponge, and pressed it into Vivian's cheek the way a man might slam a door, fast, deliberate, and completely certain he would face no consequences. The entire ballroom went silent. His investors stared. His board members stared. Nobody moved. And Vivian, 6 months pregnant, her dress ruined, frosting sliding down her jaw, stood perfectly still and thought, "This is the last time." If you've ever watched someone destroy the wrong person, stay until the end. Like this story, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this has traveled. The invitation had read, "An intimate celebration," which in Adrian Vaughn's vocabulary meant 240 guests, a rented ballroom on the 43rd floor of the Whitmore Tower, a string quartet playing near the windows, and enough floral arrangements to fill a small greenhouse. There was nothing intimate about any of it. There never was. Everything Adrian organized was designed to be looked at, remembered, and discussed the following morning in boardrooms and at breakfast tables across the city. Vivian had understood that about him for years. She'd made her peace with it, or something that resembled peace at least. She'd learned which version of herself to bring to these events. The composed one, the gracious one, the one who laughed at the right moments and touched his arm at the right moments and deflected personal questions with practiced warmth. She was good at it. She'd had enough practice. She was 6 months along, and the pregnancy showed, unmistakably, undeniably, in the way her black gown pulled across her middle and the way she had to shift her weight slightly when she stood still too long. Her ankles swelled by evening. Her lower back ached in a dull, constant way she'd learned to breathe through. She told Adrian before they left the house that she might need to sit during the dinner portion rather than stand at the reception line, and he'd given her a look. Just a look, not words, but she'd understood it clearly. And she'd ended up standing for 40 minutes greeting people whose names she sometimes remembered and sometimes didn't. The evening had been fine until it wasn't. The dinner itself went smoothly. Adrian was brilliant in these settings, attentive enough to seem warm, impressive enough to command the room without appearing to try, and skilled at making every person at the table feel like the most interesting person he'd spoken to all week. Vivian sat beside him and watched it happen, and felt the particular hollowness she always felt in these moments. The recognition that the man everyone in this room admired was a performance, and that she alone knew what the theater looked like from behind the curtain. The investors were there. Harlan Oates and his wife, 2 men from the Meridian Capital Group whose names Vivian could never keep straight. A woman named Sandra Price who ran a private equity firm and spent most of dinner watching Adrian with the focused, evaluative attention of someone calculating a number. They were in the middle of a partnership negotiation that Adrian had been working toward for the better part of 8 months. Vivian knew the broad shape of it. She wasn't kept entirely in the dark, just mostly. But she understood that tonight mattered. Tonight was about impression. Tonight was about the image Adrian Vaughn had spent years constructing. The visionary, the family man, the husband who had everything in order. That image included her. She ordered sparkling water. She asked Sandra Price about her children and remembered to follow up on the details she'd mentioned at a previous dinner, which earned her a genuine smile. She cut her food into smaller portions because her stomach had been giving her trouble for weeks, and large bites were harder to manage. And she kept her voice low, and her posture careful, and her expression open and approachable. She was performing, yes, but so was everyone at every dinner like this, and she had long since stopped finding that thought comforting. The trouble began at the end. The bill arrived, a discreet leather folder presented to Adrian's right side by a server who had the refined, neutral expression of someone trained never to react to anything. Adrian reached into his jacket pocket. His hand came back empty. He reached again, slower, into the other pocket. He checked the inner breast pocket. Then he looked at Vivian. "The Amex," he said quietly. She knew instantly what he meant. There was one card they used for events like this, a black Amex that lived in her evening bag as a backup precisely because Adrian had, twice before, left his wallet in his other jacket. She was the failsafe. She'd been the failsafe for years in more ways than one. She opened the small clutch at her side and went through it quickly. Lip balm. Her phone. The folded emergency contact card her doctor had given her. 2 hairpins. A receipt she couldn't explain. No card. Her stomach dropped. Adrian, I think I left it at home. I switched bags this afternoon, and I must have. You must have, he repeated. I can call the house. Marcus can bring it. Or we can. We're not waiting for Marcus to drive across the city. His voice was still low, controlled, polished. The investors were 3 feet away, involved in their own conversation, but the space between her and Adrian had taken on a particular quality. A thinness, like air before lightning. I have my personal card, she offered. It's a different account, but it'll. That's not the point, Vivian. She looked at him. I know. I'm sorry. I made a mistake. You make a lot of mistakes. She held very still. Around them, the dinner was winding down. Guests drifting toward the dessert station, the string quartet shifting into something softer, waiters moving with quiet efficiency. The room hummed with the specific energy of people who had eaten well and drunk well and were beginning to feel generous and pleasantly important. Nobody was watching them. Not yet. I'll sort this out, she said. Give me 2 minutes. She started to turn and he caught her arm. Not roughly, not in a way anyone watching would have categorized as rough, just firmly enough that she stopped. The dessert, he said. They're cutting the cake. You need to be there. I'll be there in 2 minutes. Now, Vivian, don't make this difficult. She looked at his hand on her arm and then at his face and nodded. She'd handle the card after. It would be fine. She put the clutch back under her arm and followed him toward the dessert station, where the 5-tier cake had been arranged at the center of the room with candles and a tasteful arrangement of white orchids at its base. The cake cutting was brief and ceremonial. Adrian made a short joke, something self-deprecating about turning 44 that made everyone laugh. Vivian stood at his side with her hands folded over her middle and smiled at all the right moments. A photographer circulated. Harlan Oates raised a glass. There was applause. Then someone handed Adrian a plate. He took it, turned to gesture toward the cake server for Vivian's slice, and something caught on the edge of the table, his sleeve, the fabric of her dress, something, and the plate shifted. He grabbed for it. The fork clattered to the floor. And in that small moment of domestic awkwardness, something shifted in his face. Vivian saw it before it happened. She'd learned to read that shift the way people learn to read weather. The particular stillness, the tightening around his jaw, the way his eyes stopped being the eyes of the man everyone else was looking at. She took a small step back. You couldn't even handle one thing, he said. His voice had dropped, but the room was quieter now, the music between pieces, and several people turned. Adrian, 1 card, 1 responsibility I gave you. He set the recovered plate down and looked at her. You can't manage a dinner without creating a problem. I made a mistake, she said carefully. I apologized. You always apologize. His jaw was tight. You apologize and you smile and then you do it again. She was aware, she was acutely, painfully aware, that they were being watched. Harlan Oates had stopped talking. Sandra Price's attention had shifted. The photographer had stilled. The server with the cake knife stood motionless 2 feet away. Let's not do this here, she said quietly. It was the wrong thing to say. She knew it was the wrong thing to say the moment it left her mouth because it implied there was a version of this that could happen somewhere else, which implied she thought there was a version of this at all, and Adrian Vaughn did not respond well to anything that suggested he was out of line. He reached into the cake. It happened the way violent things often happen, faster than the mind can properly organize, the body registering it before the brain assigns words to it. His hand went into the white frosting and dark chocolate of the top tier, fingers closing around a handful, and then he pressed it into the side of her face. her cheek, her jaw, into the carefully done hair near her temple, cold and wet and smelling of buttercream and something she would later not be able to identify, standing in a bathroom mirror, still in her dress, trying to understand what had just happened to her. She didn't move. The room did not move. 240 people, investors, politicians, journalists, socialites, business partners, wives and husbands of all of the above, stood in a ballroom on the 43rd floor of the Whitmore Tower and watched Adrian Vaughn wipe his hand on a cloth napkin and say to no one in particular, "Someone sort out the bill," and turn back toward Harlan Oates as though nothing had occurred. Vivian stood with frosting on her face and her hand pressed flat against her abdomen, instinctive, protective, the hand finding its way there without direction, and looked out at the room. Sandra Price had a glass halfway to her mouth and hadn't moved it. The string quartet had resumed playing, either because they hadn't seen or because they'd been instructed to continue regardless. The bow of the first violinist moved over the strings, and the music was soft and civilized, and it was the most obscene sound Vivian had ever heard. A young woman, one of the catering staff, no older than 22, with a dark bun and a white serving jacket, appeared at Vivian's elbow with a linen cloth. She didn't speak. She just offered it, and her eyes were soft and level and full of something Vivian recognized without naming. Vivian took the cloth. She pressed it to her cheek. She felt the weight of the baby shift inside her, a slow, rolling movement, and she breathed. She breathed again. She had learned over years of marriage how to keep her face from showing what was happening underneath it, and she used that skill now, not to protect Adrian, but to protect herself. She looked at the room, at all of those staring, averted, uncertain faces, and she said nothing. She handed the cloth back to the young woman and said quietly, "Thank you." Then she walked to the nearest chair, sat down carefully, her lower back was killing her, and reached into her clutch for her phone. She texted her driver 4 words. Front entrance, 10 minutes. She sat with her hands in her lap and her back straight and her face composed, and she waited. Adrian did not come to check on her. He was laughing at something Harlan Oates had said, one hand on the older man's shoulder, his voice carrying across the room with the easy, unhurried warmth of a man who felt entirely at home. She watched him for a long moment. She had married him because he was brilliant and magnetic, and had made her feel, briefly and convincingly, like someone who mattered to him specifically, not as a function or an accessory, but as a person he chose. She understood now, with a clarity she had been building toward for months and possibly years, that she had confused being chosen for being valued. That those two things were not the same. That Adrian chose things the way he chose everything, strategically, aesthetically, based on what they contributed to the architecture of his life. She had been architecture. Her son, the child who turned and shifted beneath her hand even now, her son would have been architecture too. She thought about the morality clause. She had been thinking about it for weeks, ever since a late night in Claire's kitchen, when Claire had leaned across the table with a printout and said very quietly, "Vivian, do you understand what this means?" The Meridian partnership wasn't just a business deal. The contract had a character provision, something she suspected Adrian's legal team had agreed to without fully examining its implications. That required Adrian to maintain what the document called demonstrable standards of personal and familial integrity for the duration of the partnership. Any material breach could trigger dissolution. She had sat in Claire's kitchen with tea she wasn't drinking and read that clause 4 times. She had not made any decisions that night. She'd driven home and walked past Adrian in the hallway without speaking and lay in the large, too-quiet bed they shared and looked at the ceiling. But something had settled in her then. Not a decision, exactly. More like a recognition. The kind that comes after you've been telling yourself a story for a long time and finally, quietly, stop. Now sitting in the ballroom with the string quartet playing and frosting drying along her hairline, she made the decision. She was going to leave him. But not the way he would expect. Not quietly, not quickly, not in a way that could be managed and minimized and explained away at the next investor dinner as a personal matter that had been handled professionally. She was going to leave him the way he deserved, She stood up, smoothed the front of her gown, and walked to the exit. She did not stop to say goodbye to anyone. She did not look back across the room at her husband. She had a call to make. She had a lawyer to wake up. And for the first time in a very long time, as the elevator doors opened and she stepped inside and the doors closed behind her and she was finally, blessedly alone, she felt something that wasn't grief or humiliation or the dull weight of a marriage going wrong. She felt clear. She pressed her hand against her stomach and felt her son move again, small and insistent, and entirely unaware of the world he was about to be born into. She was going to make sure that world was different from the one she'd been living in. She was going to make sure he never watched someone press a man's hand to his face and then stand there and absorb it because the room was watching and the marriage was useful and the moment wasn't right. She was going to make sure he knew what it looked like when a person decided to stop. The elevator reached the lobby. The doors opened. She walked out into the cool air of the building's entrance, where a doorman held the outer door without comment, and the city sprawled beyond the glass, lit and indifferent and full of people who had no idea that anything had changed tonight. Everything had changed tonight. She stood on the curb and waited for her car, and she did not cry, and the decision inside her was solid and quiet and utterly without doubt. Claire Bennett lived in a third-floor walk-up in the Caldwell district that she had been meaning to renovate for 4 years. The kitchen ceiling had a water stain shaped like the state of Florida. The radiator knocked every 40 minutes through the night. The front door stuck in humid weather and required a specific combination of lift and pull that visitors never got right on the first try. She loved it ferociously and had turned down 2 opportunities to move somewhere nicer because, as she told Vivian once, she did her best thinking in ugly spaces. It was nearly 11 at night when Vivian's car pulled up outside. She had texted ahead, just 4 words, coming to you. Tonight. And Claire had responded within 30 seconds, doors open, which meant she'd left it unlatched because she'd known Vivian would have trouble with it. Vivian climbed the stairs slowly, one hand trailing the wall. Her back was bad again, the particular grinding ache that lived just above her left hip and flared when she was on her feet too long. She'd been on her feet for 4 hours. She stopped on the second-floor landing and pressed her palm flat against the plaster and breathed. She was not going to cry in a stairwell. She climbed the last flight and pushed the door open and walked into Claire's kitchen, and Claire was already standing at the counter with 2 mugs, 1 tea, 1 coffee. And she looked at Vivian's face and at the faint ghost of frosting still caught near her temple where she hadn't managed to fully clean it in the car, and she set both mugs down and said, "Tell me everything." So Vivian sat, and she told her. She was not a dramatic storyteller. She never had been. She laid the evening out in sequence, factually, the way she'd always processed things that hurt, by organizing them, by giving them shape and order, as if structure made them less likely to pull her under. She described the dinner, the credit card, the conversation that had happened in the low, controlled tone Adrian reserved for moments when he wanted to injure her without appearing to, the cake, the way he'd walked back to Harlan Oates. When she finished, the kitchen was quiet. Claire was looking at her with an expression Vivian recognized. Not pity. Claire wasn't a pitying person, but something harder and more useful. Assessment. The same look she brought to depositions in courtrooms and apparently to her own kitchen at 11 o'clock on a Thursday night. He did it in front of Harlan Oates, Claire said, and Sandra Price, and the Meridian people, and about 235 other witnesses. He did it in front of his investors. Claire picked up her coffee and set it back down without drinking from it. While negotiating a partnership with a morality clause. Yes. He's either stupider than I thought, Claire said, or he's so certain of his own untouchability that it doesn't register. The second one, Vivian said. It's always been the second one. Claire nodded slowly. She pulled out the chair across from Vivian and sat down and leaned her elbows on the table. This was the posture Vivian associated with Claire at her most focused, the carefully maintained professional composure stripped back, replaced by something more direct and considerably more dangerous. Okay, Claire said. So, what do you want to do? I want to leave him. Obviously. How? Vivian looked at her hands on the table. Her wedding ring caught the kitchen light, a round-cut diamond in a platinum setting that Adrian had chosen without consulting her because he had excellent taste and had assumed she'd agree, which she had because she was 28 and in love with someone who didn't exist. Not quietly, she said. Not quickly. Not in a way he can spin. Claire was quiet for a moment. The morality clause, she said. Yes. Have you looked at the full contract? Only the section you showed me. I don't have access to the rest. I might. Claire stood up and walked to the narrow hallway off the kitchen. Vivian heard the sound of a filing cabinet opening, actual paper. Claire still kept paper. And then the sound of folders being moved, and then Claire came back with a manila folder that was thick enough that the clasp strained slightly. She set it on the table. Vivian looked at it. Where did you get that? Marcus Del Rey reached out to me 6 weeks ago. Claire sat back down. He's Adrian's former general counsel. He left the company in March. He came to me because he wanted to know whether he had any liability exposure for documents he'd reviewed during his tenure. And he gave you those? He gave me copies of documents that he believed constituted evidence of practices that could be considered fraudulent, which is a different thing, legally. Claire opened the folder. He also gave me the full Meridian partnership agreement, including the clause. Vivian leaned forward. The document was dense, the compressed, precise language of high-stakes corporate contracts, every word doing specific work. Claire turned to a page she'd already marked with a yellow tab and slid it across the table. Vivian read slowly. Her eyes moved down the page, and the further she read, the stiller she became. The morality clause was not, as she'd initially understood it, a general character provision. It was specific. It required Adrian Vaughn, named individually, by full legal name, not merely as a corporate representative, to maintain what the agreement called a demonstrable pattern of stable and integrity-consistent personal conduct, with particular reference to his role as a husband and expectant father. The partnership had been negotiated, in part, on the basis of Adrian's public image as a family-oriented leader. The clause gave Meridian Capital the right to terminate with cause, recover invested funds, and pursue damages if Adrian's personal conduct was found to constitute a material breach. The phrase material breach had been underlined. Claire had done that. He signed this, Vivian said. His legal team signed it on his behalf, but yes, he would have reviewed it, or he should have. Does he know what it actually says? I think he read it the way powerful men often read documents, Claire said, quickly, with the assumption that the details would be managed by someone else. She took the folder back and flipped several pages. But that's not the most interesting part. She pulled out a second document, thinner, stapled in the top left corner, and slid it across. Vivian read the header, Internal Correspondence, Vaughn Technologies, Confidential, and then below it, a chain of emails between Adrian and 2 members of his executive team, dated across a span of about 4 months. She read the first one, then the second. Then she stopped and looked up. He knew the clause was in the contract, she said. He knew. He discussed it with his team, extensively. And his strategy was, she looked back at the page. Her voice had gone flat in a way that happened when she was processing something that made her angry, but she wasn't ready to be angry yet. His strategy was to maintain the marriage for the duration of the partnership term, and then manage the exit quietly, Claire finished. His word in the third email is efficiently. He wanted to manage the exit from the marriage efficiently once the partnership terms were locked and the morality clause window had closed. The kitchen was very quiet. The radiator knocked once, distantly. Vivian sat back in her chair. The baby moved. A slow shift, a press against her ribs that wasn't painful but was unmistakable. And she put her hand over her middle without thinking about it. I was the asset, she said. Me and... She pressed her hand more firmly. Both of us. In his calculation, Claire said carefully. Yes, that appears to be what the documents suggest. He was going to wait until the contract was secure and then divorce me. That's my reading. Vivian was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the water stain on Claire's ceiling and thought about the last time Adrian had told her he loved her, and tried to remember when exactly that was, and found that she couldn't precisely locate it, which told her something she probably already knew. I want him to lose everything, she said. It came out very calm, which surprised her slightly. Claire looked at her for a moment. I know. Not out of spite. She was examining that as she said it, making sure it was true. I want there to be consequences, real ones. I want it to cost him what he made it cost me. That's distinguishable from spite, Claire said. Barely. But legally, it doesn't matter which it is. She picked up her coffee again. This time, she actually drank from it. Here's the problem with filing for divorce immediately. Adrian's team will see it coming. They'll have 30 lawyers in a conference room by Monday morning, and they'll start building the containment strategy before the ink is dry on the filing. They'll negotiate a settlement that protects his reputation. They'll agree to whatever terms keep Vivian Vaughn quiet, and within 6 months the story will be difficult personal circumstances, handled maturely, business unaffected. He comes out of it with a check and a PR win. So we don't file immediately. We don't file immediately. Vivian looked at her. What do we do instead? Claire set her mug down and folded her hands on the table. We wait, she said. We gather, and we choose the moment. What followed over the next 11 days was the most deliberately disciplined performance of Vivian's life, which was saying something, given that the previous several years had involved considerable performance. She went home that night and slept badly, and woke at 5 in the morning and lay in the silence of the bedroom while Adrian slept beside her with the uncomplicated ease of a man who didn't believe he'd done anything wrong. She listened to him breathe and thought about the documents on Claire's kitchen table and felt the hard, specific weight of what she was carrying, and she decided that she was going to carry it well. Adrian did not apologize. She had known he wouldn't, but some part of her had expected him to at least make a gesture toward it, to acknowledge, privately, that the moment had been poorly managed, if not that he had been wrong. He did not. The morning after the party, he came into the kitchen while she was sitting at the table with a glass of water and a piece of toast she wasn't eating, and he poured himself coffee and stood at the counter and said, "The Meridian people are having second thoughts. Harlan called this morning." "I see," she said. "I need you at the gala." He looked at her over the rim of the mug. "The charity event. It's in 2 weeks." "I'm aware of the gala," she said. "I need you present and visible." He set the mug down. "What happened last night? I'd rather not discuss it." He paused. She watched him recalibrate. She'd become fluent in that process, the small adjustment he made when he encountered resistance he hadn't anticipated. "What happened last night was a stressful moment in an important evening," he said. "I may have reacted more sharply than the situation warranted." That was the closest to an apology she would ever receive from Adrian Vaughn, and they both knew it. "The gala," she said. "I'll be there." He picked up his coffee and left the kitchen, and she sat at the table and looked at her toast and thought, 2 weeks. She called Claire from her car that afternoon. "He's already trying to repair with the investors," she said. "Of course he is." Claire's voice had the slightly compressed quality it got when she was walking somewhere fast. "Harlan Oates reached out to my firm this morning. Not to me directly, to our litigation department. He's trying to figure out whether what happened last night constitutes a triggerable event under the contract." Vivian's grip tightened on the phone. "What did your firm tell him?" "That we couldn't advise him without reviewing the contract, which we now happen to have a copy of." A brief pause, the sound of a door opening. "He'll get a second opinion elsewhere, but it bought us time. And it told me something important. That Harlan's already uncomfortable." "That Harlan's already uncomfortable," Claire confirmed. "Which means the Meridian team saw exactly what we saw last night. They're not writing it off, they're watching." Vivian exhaled slowly. "So if something else happens, or if last night gets documented and submitted as evidence of a pattern, the clause becomes very, very actionable." Claire's voice shifted slightly, became the particular register she used when she was laying out strategy. "I want you to do something for me. I want you to start keeping a record. Not anything dramatic, just dates, incidents, the things you've normalized over the years. Write them down. Be specific. Times, locations, what was said, who might have witnessed it. Like a diary. Like a legal document that happens to be written in first person." Vivian looked out the car window at the city moving past. A woman was pushing a stroller on the sidewalk, one hand managing the handle, the other pressed to her phone. An ordinary Wednesday afternoon. People everywhere going about their ordinary Wednesdays. "All right," she said. "And Vivian." Claire's voice had gone quieter. "I need you to talk to me about your father." There was a pause. "Why?" Vivian said. "Because I've been doing some research, and I think you've been very careful, for a very long time, not to let Adrian know something important about you." Vivian looked at her hands in her lap. Her father, Elliot Wren, who had built Wren Capital from a regional investment firm into one of the most quietly powerful private equity structures in the country. Quietly being the operative word, because Elliot Wren had never once sought a newspaper profile or a speaking engagement or a board seat that came with any public visibility. He operated the way deep water operated. Everything below the surface, the weight felt rather than seen. Vivian had kept her relationship with her father carefully separate from her marriage to Adrian, not because she was ashamed of either, though the marriage had become something she was deeply ashamed of, but because she had understood, from the early months, that Adrian was drawn to acquisition, that knowing her father's name, her father's reach, would have changed the nature of his interest in her in ways she hadn't wanted to examine. She'd told him her father was a retired investor. Adrian had accepted that because he'd been more interested in how she looked at a dinner table than in the specifics of her family background. "He doesn't know about Wren Capital," she said. "I know he doesn't know," Claire said. "That's what I'm telling you." Another pause, longer this time. "Claire," Vivian said slowly, "what are you thinking?" "I'm thinking," Claire said, "that you've been sitting across the table from a man who believes he has all the leverage in this situation. And I'm thinking that what's about to happen when he discovers the actual shape of the board is going to be one of the most significant moments of his professional life." Vivian was quiet. "I want him to be the last to know," she said finally. "He will be," Claire said. "That's the whole point." She reached out to her father that evening, not by phone. Elliot Wren did not do important business by phone, but in person, driving 90 minutes to the house outside the city where he'd lived for 20 years. The rambling stone property with the long unpaved driveway that he refused to pave because, he said, the sound of gravel was the best security system money hadn't needed to buy. He was in the study when she arrived, which was where he always was in the evenings, in a room that smelled of old paper and cedar and the particular stillness of someone who had spent decades learning when not to move. He was 71. He looked 60. He had her same eyes, the shade and the particular quality of attention in them, the way they registered things without immediately responding. He looked at her face when she walked in, and she watched him take in the same thing Claire had taken in, the faint trace of something around her temple, the posture she'd been carrying for days now, the specific way a person holds themselves when they've absorbed something they're still metabolizing. "Sit down," he said. She sat. "Tell me," he said. She did, but differently than she'd told Claire. With Claire, she'd been precise, sequential, legal. With her father, she was simply honest, which for Vivian had always been a harder thing to be. She told him about the birthday dinner. She told him about the morality clause. She told him about what she and Claire were building. She told him about the gala in 2 weeks, the 200 people in the ballroom, the investors Adrian was scrambling to reassure. Her father listened with his hands folded and his face even and his attention total. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment that lasted long enough that she almost said something to fill it. Then he said, "What do you need from me?" Not, "Why didn't you come to me sooner?" Not, "I told you something was wrong with him." Not any of the things that would have been easy and human and unhelpful. Just the only question that mattered. "I need you to come to the gala," she said. He looked at her steadily. "As what?" "As my father." She held his gaze. "And then afterward, as what you actually are." Elliot Wren studied her for a long moment. In that moment, she saw something she didn't often see in her father's face, something he kept compressed and controlled the same way she kept things compressed and controlled, because they were built from the same material. He was furious. Not loudly, not dramatically. The way a river is cold, all the way through, consistently, without exception. "All right," he said. She drove back to the city. She let herself into the house. Adrian was out, some dinner she hadn't been required to attend, and went upstairs and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a while. The baby moved, a pattern she was beginning to recognize. A particular sequence of movement that happened in the evenings when she was still. She put both hands on her stomach and sat with that for a while. She thought about Adrian sleeping peacefully while he built his containment strategy. She thought about the Meridian lawyers. She thought about the gala, the flowers they'd already ordered, the guest list she'd reviewed, the table arrangements she'd approved as the diligent, capable wife she'd been pretending to be for years. 200 people in a ballroom, the right 200 people. She'd spent her marriage being used as a stage piece in Adrian's performance. It seemed only fair, she thought, that his final performance happen on a stage she'd helped build. She lay back on the bed and looked at the ceiling and listened to the house settle around her. And she let herself feel for a moment the full size of what was coming, the risk of it, the cost of it, the weight of a decision that couldn't be undone. And then she set it down. She was ready. The 2 weeks between the birthday dinner and the charity gala were the strangest of Vivian's life, and she had lived through some strange ones. She went through the motions of her daily existence with a steadiness that surprised even her. She attended the prenatal appointment on Tuesday and let the doctor talk about iron levels and sleep position and the importance of managing stress without any visible reaction to the irony. She reviewed the gala's seating chart on Wednesday afternoon, sitting at the desk in the home office she'd been given, a smaller room, naturally, than Adrian's, and made adjustments to table arrangements with the focused attention of someone who understood exactly why those adjustments mattered. She had dinner with Adrian 3 times in those 2 weeks. She passed him the salt. She asked about his meetings. She absorbed his moods with the practiced, reflexive skill of a woman who had been doing it so long that the skill had become invisible even to herself. He was in a better mood than she expected, which told her something. Adrian performed confidence when he was frightened. The wider his smile at dinner, the more phone calls he was making in private. He had clearly been working the phones hard. Harlan Oates, the Meridian people, whoever else was watching the situation with careful eyes, and whatever he'd told them had apparently landed, because by the end of the first week, he seemed settled again. The gala would be his proof of concept. 200 people watching Adrian Vaughn at his best, his wife gracious and visibly pregnant beside him, the whole flawless portrait of a man who had everything under control. He believed it completely. That was the thing about Adrian that had once seemed like confidence and now seemed like something else entirely. He had no capacity to imagine a version of events in which he wasn't the one in control of the outcome. Vivian filed that observation away with all the others. Claire worked fast. In 11 days, she assembled a documentation package that was methodical and devastating. Vivian's written record, 12 typed pages of incidents organized chronologically with dates and locations, and what witnesses had been present. The emails Marcus Del Rey had provided, the full Meridian contract with the morality clause annotated, 3 additional statements from former Vaughn Technologies employees who had been waiting, as people often wait, for something that looked like an actual exit ramp before they were willing to put their names on anything. Claire had also retained a media consultant named Patrick Dow, who was 50-something and had the professionally relaxed manner of a man who had managed crises long enough to stop being impressed by them. He knew which journalist to call and when, and more importantly, he knew how to ensure that when a story broke, it broke in a way that couldn't be dismissed as a personal dispute or a disgruntled spouse's accusations. Timing, Patrick had told Vivian during their one meeting, in Claire's office with the Florida-shaped water stain visible through the open kitchen doorway. A story released before an event is speculation. A story released during an event is news. A story released after an event, when there are 200 witnesses, is fact. During, Vivian had said. During, he'd confirmed. The other conversation, the one she'd been careful not to have until the moment was exactly right, happened 4 days before the gala. She was in her father's study again, late afternoon, the light through the windows going the particular amber of autumn evenings. Elliot Wren was behind his desk with a folder open in front of him that she recognized as Claire's documentation package. She'd arranged for it to be delivered to him. And he was reading with the same focused stillness he brought to everything. He closed the folder when she sat down. "Your attorney is thorough," he said. "She's the best I know." "She's the best in the city," he said, which was not the same thing but also not a contradiction. "The morality clause exposure is significant. I had my own team review the contract last night. If this goes to arbitration and Meridian pursues damages, the number could reach 8 figures. I know. And the company's valuation depends heavily on the partnership. Without it, the valuation falls. She'd worked through this already. Significantly. Her father looked at her. What are you planning exactly? For the gala? I'm going to speak. A pause. To whom? Everyone in the room. She met his eyes. He's going to ask me to say something. He always does. He frames it as a spontaneous moment, but he plans it. He'll give me a signal, and I'll take the microphone and say something gracious about his vision and his generosity, and what a wonderful husband and father-to-be he is. She paused. I'm going to do it differently this time. Her father was quiet for a long enough moment that she began to feel the edges of uncertainty. Not about the plan, but about him, about whether he would tell her it was too much, too exposed, too risky for someone 7 months pregnant to be standing at a microphone in front of 200 people setting fire to her own life. He said, will you be all right, physically? Not, don't do this. Not, let me handle it. Just that. Yes, she said. And afterward? The moment it's done, the room shifts. There may be, Claire will be there. And you. She looked at him steadily. I need you visible. I need people to see your face when they realize who you are. Elliot Wren had kept himself invisible for a very long time, not because he was weak, the opposite, because he understood that visible power invited visible challenge, and he preferred to operate in the spaces where no one thought to look. He had built an empire specifically designed to be underestimated. Vivian was asking him to be seen, which was the thing he had spent 40 years specifically avoiding. He nodded once. All right, he said. The night of the gala arrived the way significant nights always arrive, too fast, and then, in the hours immediately preceding, almost agonizingly slowly. Vivian dressed at home, in the bedroom, in a gown she'd bought 3 weeks ago specifically for this evening. It was deep burgundy, structured at the bodice to accommodate her pregnancy gracefully, and she had chosen it because it was the kind of dress that required no apology and offered no softness. She stood in front of the mirror and looked at herself for a moment, the curve of her belly, the line of her shoulders, the face she'd been living in for 34 years, and thought, this is the last time you will stand here as his wife. Adrian came in while she was doing her earrings and looked at her the way he looked at things he considered well arranged. Good, he said. We should leave in 20 minutes. She clipped the second earring into place. I'll be ready. The Aldrich Hotel ballroom was everything Adrian's events were, precise and expensive, and calibrated to produce a specific emotional response in people who understood the language of expensive precision. The floral arrangements were white and gold. The lighting was warm without being intimate. The room could hold 300 and was hosting 212, which meant there was exactly enough space to move without crowding, which meant people circulated, which meant Adrian could work the room the way he worked every room, in slow, deliberate arcs that covered the maximum number of important contacts. Vivian arrived on his arm and smiled at the right people and accepted the compliments about her pregnancy with the warmth that had become second nature and looked, she was certain, exactly like what she was supposed to look like. Adrian touched the small of her back twice in the first 20 minutes, a public gesture of husbandly attentiveness that she had once found comforting and now understood as choreography. She spotted Claire near the east wall, in a dark green dress, holding a glass of sparkling water and speaking to a man Vivian didn't recognize. Claire caught her eye across the room for a half second. No gesture, no signal, just eye contact, and looked away. Good. Claire was where she needed to be. She spotted Patrick Dow near the entrance, also holding a glass, also talking to someone, also exactly where he needed to be. 3 journalists he'd contacted were in the room. She'd memorized their faces from photos Claire had shown her. All 3 were present. She had not yet spotted her father. Harlan Oates found her near the drinks table at 30 minutes in. He was a large man, mid-60s, with the particular bearing of someone who had spent decades being the most important person in most rooms and had stopped noticing it. He shook her hand rather than kissing her cheek, which she registered. Vivian, he said, you look well. Thank you, Harlan. I feel well. A brief pause. He had the look of a man choosing his words carefully, which was not his default. Harlan Oates was known for directness. "The other evening," he said. "Was a difficult evening," she said smoothly. "Adrian's been under considerable pressure. I'm sure you understand." Harlan looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. It wasn't quite sympathy. It wasn't quite calculation. It was something between the two. "Of course," he said. He excused himself, and she watched him go and thought, "He knows it's bad. He's already decided." Then she felt a hand at her elbow, light, a specific touch she recognized, and turned. Her father was standing beside her in a dark suit, his silver hair brushed back from his forehead, his expression the same measured calm it always was. He looked like what he was, a man who had nothing to prove to anyone in this room, which was the most quietly powerful thing a person could look like. "You came," she said, which was unnecessary, but it slipped out. "I told you I would," he said. She took his arm for a moment, just a moment, brief and almost invisible, and then straightened. "Don't let Adrian see you yet," she said quietly. "I know. Let him get through the dinner. He'll call me up after the awards presentation." "I'll be near the back," her father said. "I'll move forward when it's time." She nodded and released his arm and turned back toward the room. Dinner was 2.5 hours that felt both long and fast. The way that things feel when your attention is split between the surface, the food, the conversation, the performance, and what is moving underneath it. Adrian was in excellent form. He gave a short speech before dinner that was warm and self-deprecating and landed well. And she watched the room respond and thought about how good he was at this, and felt something that wasn't quite grief, but was adjacent to it. The waste of it. The genuine talent applied to the consistent maintenance of a lie. He touched her hand during the main course and leaned close to say something about the centerpieces, a private joke about the florist they'd used for their wedding, and she laughed at exactly the right volume and thought about Claire's documentation package and the 3 journalists and her father standing somewhere near the back of the room. The awards presentation came at 9:15. Adrian's foundation was recognizing 3 organizations for their community impact work, which was legitimate. The foundation did real work, or at least funded it. She'd helped build the program. She was allowed to feel complicated about that. She was standing slightly behind Adrian's left shoulder when he finished the last presentation and turned and found her with his eyes, and she saw the signal, a small tilt of his head toward the podium, and felt the room's attention shift in that anticipatory way that rooms shift when they sense a planned moment about to occur. She walked to the podium. He stepped aside for her with a smile that she had once thought was loving and now understood was property management. She reached the microphone and adjusted it slightly, the room settling into that particular attentive hush. She looked out at 212 faces. She found Claire first, over to the left, very still. She found Patrick Dow, who had moved closer to the journalists. She found Harlan Oates at a table near the center, his wife beside him, both of them watching. She found Sandra Price. She found the faces of the Meridian partners she'd cataloged over months of dinners. She found 3 faces she recognized as journalists. Then, at the back of the room, near the west wall, she found her father. He was standing rather than sitting. His hands were at his sides. His face was entirely composed. He gave her one small nod. She looked back at the room, at all of those waiting, expectant faces, and she took one breath, and she began. "I've stood beside my husband at events like this for almost 4 years," she said. Her voice was steady. She'd known it would be because she'd discovered years ago that she was steadiest when things were most serious. "I've given shorter versions of this speech many times. The one where I talk about his vision, his generosity, what an honor it is to be his partner." She paused. "I'm not going to give that speech tonight." The room shifted. Not loudly. A hush is still a hush. But the quality of the attention changed. Adrian, standing to her right, went very still. "2 weeks ago," she said, "at my husband's birthday celebration, in front of his investors and business partners, he pressed a fistful of birthday cake into my face." She let that land, let the room sit with it for a full 3 seconds. "I am 7 months pregnant. The guests around us didn't move. The music kept playing. and my husband walked back to his conversation as though nothing had happened. She heard a sound from Adrian, not words, something before words, but she did not look at him. "I've been trying to find the right way to characterize what that moment was," she continued. "Not the most painful moment of my marriage. There have been others. But perhaps the clearest one. The moment where the mask slipped completely, and what was underneath it was exactly what I had been telling myself for years, wasn't there." She paused. "I married a man who needed a wife the way a building needs a lobby. Not because he loved me, because I completed the image." The ballroom was absolutely silent. The kind of silence that happens when a room full of people all make the same involuntary decision to stop moving. "I want to be clear about what I'm doing tonight," Vivian said. "I am not a woman scorned making a scene. I am a woman who has spent 4 years being managed, controlled, and gradually reduced, and who has spent the last 2 weeks asking herself why she was going to stand at this microphone and say the same gracious things she always says." She looked at the room steadily. "I couldn't come up with a good answer." Adrian said, "Vivian." Low. A warning. She didn't look at him. "My husband's current business partnership," she said, "the one this evening is partly designed to shore up, contains a morality clause that requires him to demonstrate what the contract calls integrity-consistent personal conduct. He knew about that clause before he signed. He discussed it with his team. And his strategy, as documented in internal correspondence, was to maintain this marriage until the partnership was secured and then exit it quietly." She felt the room react. Not loud, a kind of collective intake. "My husband used our marriage and our unborn child as business instruments. And I think the people in this room who have made significant financial decisions based on the integrity of his character deserve to know that. That is enough." Adrian's voice had shifted. No longer a warning, something with more pressure behind it. He moved toward her. She stood her ground. She was at the microphone and he was not, and she had calculated this in advance, and she stayed exactly where she was. "The last thing I want to say," she continued, her voice unhurried, "is this. There are women in this city, in every city, who are living inside the same architecture I lived in. Marriages that look from outside like the thing everyone is supposed to want, and feel, from inside, like something else entirely. I spent 4 years being afraid of what leaving would cost me." She put one hand over her middle, unhurried and deliberate. "Tonight I found out what staying was going to cost my son, and that made everything else very simple." She stepped back from the microphone. The room did not erupt. It did something more unsettling. It stayed quiet, but a different quiet than before. The kind of quiet that precedes something, that exists in the space between a decision and its consequences. Adrian reached for her arm. "Let go of my arm," she said quietly. He did not let go. And that was when she heard it. The sound of measured footsteps crossing the ballroom floor, the particular sound of someone moving with the unhurried purpose of a person who has nowhere to be except exactly here. She didn't need to look. She knew those footsteps. But she looked anyway, because she wanted to see Adrian's face when he saw. Elliot Wren walked through the parted guests with his hands at his sides and his face composed, and his eyes fixed on Adrian Vaughn with the steady, cold attention of a man who had spent 40 years waiting for the correct moment and had just arrived at it. He stopped 6 feet away. He was not a physically imposing man. Average height, silver-haired, 71 years old. He didn't need to be imposing. The weight in the room moved differently the moment he stopped, as if the air itself was recalibrating. Adrian stared at him. Vivian watched the recognition cross her husband's face. Slow, then faster, then the particular color change that happens when a person's blood pressure does something significant. She watched him look between her and her father and back again, and she watched him understand. Not just who Elliot Wren was. What it meant that Elliot Wren was here, in this room, that he had apparently known in advance, that his wife, his asset, his lobby, his instrument, was Elliot Wren's daughter. "Adrian," her father said. His voice was entirely level, the voice of a man making a statement that requires no amplification. "I think you should take your hand off my daughter's arm." The hand released. The room around them was a held breath. Vivian looked at her husband's face, the face of a man who had operated for years on the certainty that he understood every variable. And she saw the moment he realized he had miscalculated in a way that had no correction available to it. She turned away from him. She walked to where Claire was standing and felt Claire fall into step beside her, and together they moved toward the exit, and the parting of the guests around them was the most effortless thing Vivian had done in 4 years. Behind her, she heard the room begin to move again, the sound of 200 people exhaling at once, beginning to speak, beginning to reach for their phones. And she did not look back. Her father appeared at her other side before she reached the door. The three of them walked out of the ballroom together, into the corridor, into the cool air of the hotel lobby, and the sound of the room behind them rose and rose, and Vivian kept walking, her hand over her son, her father on her left, her best friend on her right, and the whole architecture of the last 4 years collapsing quietly behind her like a building that had always been built wrong. The first call came at 11:47 that night. Vivian was in the guest bedroom of her father's house, the room she'd used as a teenager when she visited, which still had the same cream-colored curtains and the same small desk under the window, sitting on the edge of the bed with her shoes off and her feet on the floor when she heard her phone buzz on the nightstand. She looked at the screen. Adrian. She set it face down and let it go to voicemail. It buzzed again immediately. Then again. Then a pause of about 4 minutes, during which she changed out of the burgundy gown and into the spare clothes she'd brought in a bag she'd packed 3 days ago and left at her father's house specifically so she would not have to go back to the house on Hargrove Street tonight. She pulled on a loose shirt and soft trousers and sat back on the edge of the bed and looked at her phone. 7 missed calls, 2 voicemails, 4 texts, the last of which read simply, "We need to talk tonight. This is not negotiable." She opened a text to Claire instead. "I'm at my father's. I'm fine. What's happening?" Claire's response came in 40 seconds. Patrick's 3 journalists filed within the hour, 2 outlets already running digital pieces. One's leading with the morality clause angle. The other went with the birthday incident as the hook. Both mentioned Wren Capital. A pause, then, "Vivian, it's moving fast, faster than we planned for." She read that twice. She had planned for fast. She and Claire and Patrick had talked about the velocity of these things, how quickly a story with this many elements, this many witnesses, this much documented evidence could travel. She had thought she was prepared for fast. She was not entirely prepared for what fast actually felt like, sitting alone in a quiet room at midnight while the world outside rearranged itself around something she had set in motion. There was no satisfaction in it yet. There was something more complicated, the particular hollowness that comes after you've done an irreversible thing and the adrenaline has started to drain, and what's left is just the reality of it, stripped of drama, asking you to live inside it. She put the phone down and lay back on the bed and put both hands on her stomach and breathed. The baby kicked once, hard and decisive, which was either coincidence or the universe having a sense of humor. "I know," she said to the ceiling. "Me too." By morning, the story had moved from 2 outlets to 11. Vivian sat at her father's kitchen table at 7 a.m. with a cup of tea she was actually drinking this time, and her laptop open, and watched it happen with a strange detachment, as if she were observing something at a distance that was technically about her. The coverage split roughly into 2 categories: the personal narrative, tech billionaire's pregnant wife, confronts husband at charity gala, and the financial angle, which the business press had picked up by 4 in the morning and was running with the particular enthusiasm journalists reserve for stories that combine scandal with specific documentable numbers. The Meridian Partnership, the morality clause, the valuation implications. 3 separate outlets had independently calculated what a triggered breach might cost Vaughn Technologies, and the numbers ranged from significant to catastrophic. Her father came into the kitchen at 7:15, already dressed, a phone to his ear that he lowered when he saw her. "Eat something," he said, which was his version of "How are you?" and went back to his call. She found bread and made toast, which she ate standing at the counter because sitting had become uncomfortable in the last week. The baby's position had shifted and extended, sitting pressed on something that made her back worse. She ate the toast and looked out the window at the garden, overgrown in the way her father's garden was always overgrown, because he hired someone to maintain it, but couldn't stop himself from having opinions about which plants should be allowed to do what they wanted, and thought about what came next. What came next arrived in the form of Claire at 8:30, letting herself in with the key she'd had for years, carrying 2 coffees from the place 3 blocks away, and a leather folder that had the look of something she'd been adding to since before dawn. Harlan Oates issued a statement at 6 a.m., Claire said, setting the coffees on the table and opening the folder. His PR team moved fast. He's not naming Adrian specifically, but the language is... She found the page. We are reviewing all active partnership agreements in light of recently surfaced information and will make decisions consistent with our fiduciary obligations and our organization's values, which in plain English means, they're pulling out, Vivian said. They're pulling out. Claire sat down. The Meridian team has been less public about it, but I had a call from their general counsel at 7 this morning. They're invoking the clause. Formally, the letter goes to Adrian's legal team today. Vivian absorbed this. What does that trigger? Fund recovery provisions, damage assessment, a formal arbitration process that will take months and be expensive and very, very public. Claire looked at her steadily. His legal team is going to fight it, but the emails, the ones where he discusses the clause strategically, the ones Marcus provided, those are going to be very difficult to argue around. He knew what he was agreeing to. He had a plan to manage it, and then he assaulted his pregnant wife in front of witnesses at a dinner with the exact investors the clause was designed to protect. Vivian set her toast down. How bad is it? For the company. Claire was quiet for a moment in the particular way that meant the answer was worse than she wanted to lead with. Vaughn Technologies opened this morning down 19%. It was halted twice before 10 a.m., pending volatility controls. She paused. 3 board members have requested an emergency session. 2 of his senior executives, the COO and the head of product, have gone quiet in a way that suggests they're talking to outside counsel. 19%. Vivian ran the math without wanting to. The company's last public valuation, 19% of that number. The number it produced was large enough that she had to set it down and not look at it directly. Where is Adrian? She said. His PR team issued a statement at 7. The language was... Claire found another page. Mr. Vaughn acknowledges that a private family matter has become public in a manner that is painful for all involved. He is committed to addressing these matters with dignity and discretion and asks that the privacy of his family, particularly his expectant wife, be respected during this difficult time. She looked up. He's trying to frame it as a mutual situation. Private family difficulty, both parties affected, keep the press out of it. He called me his expectant wife, Vivian said. Yes. 14 hours ago, I walked out of his gala with my father, and his best legal play is to claim we're a unit experiencing difficulty. It's a bad play, Claire said. His team knows it. They're operating in crisis mode and making crisis mode decisions. The statement was out too fast and the framing is wrong, and anyone who was in that ballroom last night knows it's wrong. She closed the folder. Patrick has been fielding requests since midnight. He wants to talk to you about a follow-up statement. Something brief, something that redirects from the personal dispute framing and recenters the structural issues. Vivian thought about that. Not yet, she said. Let the news cycle run. The documents speak. I don't need to. Claire looked at her with something that was almost a smile. That's exactly what Patrick said you'd say. Then he's a smart man. The divorce filing happened 4 days later, and by that point it was almost anticlimactic. A procedural event in a situation that had already moved well past procedures into something more fundamental and irreversible. Claire filed in the morning. By afternoon, Adrian's legal team had responded with a counterfiling and a request for emergency mediation, which Claire declined on Vivian's behalf on the grounds that mediation required good faith participation from both parties, and the documented evidence of Adrian's conduct and strategic intentions made that prerequisite difficult to establish. The response from Adrian's team was aggressive in the way that responses are aggressive when the team knows the underlying position is weak. A flurry of motions, a document request so broad it was essentially a fishing expedition, and a letter sent to Claire, not to Vivian directly, which was itself a kind of message, suggesting that certain private medical and financial information might become relevant to proceedings if the matter were not resolved expeditiously. Vivian read the letter at Claire's kitchen table on a Thursday evening and felt the anger arrive properly for the first time since all of this had begun. Not the cold, controlled recognition she'd carried for weeks, something hotter and less organized. "He's threatening to use my pregnancy," she said. "He's suggesting he might try to," Claire said. "It's an empty threat. There's no legitimate legal strategy that involves... He's threatening to use my pregnancy in a divorce proceeding to pressure me to settle quietly." She set the letter down. Her hands were not entirely steady. "He has not changed at all." "No," Claire said. "He hasn't." "Good." She picked up her tea. "Because if he had changed, I might have felt conflicted about what comes next." What came next, in the weeks following the gala, was the kind of sustained unraveling that happens when a reputation built on image rather than substance loses the image. It doesn't collapse all at once. It erodes, piece by piece, revelation by revelation, each new development making the previous ones more legible in retrospect. The journalists who'd been in the ballroom had written their initial pieces from what they'd witnessed, but Patrick Dow's careful management of the subsequent weeks meant that the follow-up coverage was deeper and more damaging than the initial burst. 3 former Vaughn Technologies employees who had stayed silent through Marcus Delray's original outreach now came forward, separately, to separate outlets, with accounts of a workplace culture that reflected the same patterns Vivian had described. A controlling leadership style, decisions made and then attributed to subordinates when they went wrong. A systematic practice of presenting a public face of collaborative, progressive management while operating internally through fear and approval seeking. None of it was illegal. Most of it was the kind of thing that gets whispered about in industries and never quite breaks into print because no single account is sufficiently dramatic on its own. Taken together, alongside the birthday incident, alongside the gala speech, alongside the documented emails about the morality clause, they told a coherent story. And coherent stories, in Vivian's experience, were the ones that stuck. She followed the coverage from a remove that she was deliberately maintaining, not because she was indifferent, but because she understood that her ability to function and to build what she was building depended on not spending every day inside the news cycle. She was 8 months pregnant. She needed to sleep, which she did badly. She needed to eat, which she did adequately. She needed to walk, which she did every morning through her father's overgrown garden, moving slowly with one hand at the small of her back and her mind working through the logistics of what she and Claire were putting together. The Haven Initiative had been Claire's phrase first, offered as an offhand suggestion in the kitchen at 11 one night, and Vivian had known immediately that it was right. Not just the name, but the whole shape of what it described. Not a charity at arm's length, something she funded and attended galas for. A working organization. Legal support, because the thing she'd had that most women in her situation didn't have was Claire, a brilliant attorney who was also a friend, who understood both the law and the human situation it was being applied to. Emergency shelter, because the barrier between deciding to leave and actually leaving was almost always physical and financial, not emotional. Women didn't stay because they didn't know they should go. They stayed because the logistics of going were impossible, and financial guidance because the economic dependence that abusive relationships systematically cultivated was itself a trap, and dismantling it required specific practical expertise. She had the resources to build it. Her father had offered more, not loudly, not as a condition of anything, just set it on the table one morning over breakfast with the same matter-of-fact quality he brought to everything. "The endowment structure," he'd said, sliding a document across. "Review it with Bennett. I want this to be independent of my holdings and yours, standalone, self-sustaining within 5 years." She'd looked at the document and then at him. "You've already drafted it." "I had thoughts about the structure," he said, which was his version of yes. "Dad." He'd picked up his coffee. "Eat your eggs." She'd laughed, which had surprised her. Actual laughter, unperformed, the kind that arrives when something is unexpectedly funny and the body responds before the mind can decide whether humor is appropriate. She'd laughed, and her father had looked at her with an expression that was not quite a smile but was the closest he got, and she'd thought, this is what I was protecting him from knowing. The fact that I was living inside something that had squeezed the laughter out of me so gradually I hadn't noticed it was gone. The Haven Initiative was incorporated 3 weeks after the gala. Claire took on the legal directorship as a parallel role to her practice. Vivian took the executive position, which meant spending long days on the phone and in meetings, and occasionally sitting in a conference room with her feet elevated on a second chair because her ankles had made certain non-negotiable demands, working through the operational structure with people who were better at this specific kind of work than she was, which was something she was trying to get more comfortable acknowledging. She'd spent years in a marriage where not knowing something was a liability. It was taking time to learn that it could be, in the right environment, simply a fact. The first intake call the Haven Initiative handled came 7 days after incorporation. Claire took it herself because the legal team wasn't fully in place yet and the social workers they'd retained were still being onboarded, and because Claire Bennett was constitutionally incapable of letting a call go unanswered when she was the only one available. She told Vivian about it afterward. A woman in the south side of the city, 2 children, a husband whose version of control looked different from Adrian's but operated on the same fundamental logic, and who had called because she'd seen the coverage of the gala and had felt, for the first time in years, like something that had happened to her had a name. Vivian sat with that for a long time. Meanwhile, Adrian's world continued its restructuring. The arbitration with Meridian was formally initiated, with damages claimed in a range that made the financial press update their earlier estimates significantly upward. 2 board members resigned, one with a public statement, one without. A mid-sized competitor that had been circling Vaughn Technologies for 2 years issued what was described as an exploratory inquiry about acquisition, which Adrian's remaining team rejected, though the rejection had the quality of a bluff rather than a position of strength. His PR team cycled through 3 different narrative strategies in as many weeks. The first was the private family matter framing, which died within days. The second was an attempt to shift focus to Adrian's philanthropic work, a move that backfired when it reminded journalists that his charitable foundation's largest gala had been the site of his wife's speech, a detail that several outlets found too good not to revisit. The third strategy was silence, which was the most competent of the 3 and arrived about 2 weeks too late to do meaningful damage control. He called her twice more in those weeks. She did not answer either call. He sent a message through his attorney suggesting a private meeting, which Claire declined in writing with a specificity that made clear how well documented the reasons for declining were. He sent one personal text. She saw it arrive but did not open it for 3 days, and when she did open it, it said, "I need you to know I understand I made a mistake." She read it twice and put her phone down and went back to the intake form she'd been reviewing and did not respond. A mistake was a credit card forgotten in the wrong bag. A mistake was a misspoken word in a difficult conversation. What he had done, the pattern of it, the architecture of it, the careful and documented strategy of it, was not a mistake. It was a series of decisions made by a person who believed the decisions were his to make about someone who had no recourse. She didn't need him to understand the difference. She just needed to be out of the range of it. The divorce proceedings moved in the lumbering, expensive way that contested divorces move when both parties have significant assets and one party has significant incentive to delay. Claire was methodical and unhurried, which drove Adrian's team toward the impatient, overreaching moves that methodical attorneys wait for. By the end of the 4th week, 3 of his team's motions had been denied. One of their discovery requests had been turned back on them, with a counter-request that was considerably more surgical and considerably more likely to produce documents that were useful to Vivian's case. Vivian was not following every development in real time. She'd made a decision in the 2nd week, not a dramatic decision, just a quiet personal policy, that she would receive updates from Claire at the end of each day in a single call, and that the hours in between would be for the work she was actually trying to build and the pregnancy she was actually trying to manage. She was 34 years old and 8 months pregnant, and running a new organization and sleeping badly and eating adequately and walking through her father's garden every morning, and the bandwidth for sustained outrage was limited. She used what she had carefully. She was in a meeting with the Haven Initiative's newly hired director of operations, a woman named Rosario, who had spent 15 years at a domestic violence nonprofit and had the particular expertise of someone who has spent a long time doing necessary work without nearly enough support, when Claire called. The meeting was winding down and she let it finish properly before she picked up. Update, Claire said. Meridian's formal damage claim went to arbitration today. The number is confirmed. Adrian's legal team has filed a response that is, and I'm quoting their own document, a good faith effort to contextualize the conduct in question within the broader pressures of the relevant business period, which is the most expensive way I've seen anyone say he was stressed. What does his team actually think their position is? Privately? I think they're negotiating toward a settlement. The arbitration timeline is long, and the publicity exposure is significant, and I think they've done the math on what a protracted fight costs versus what an agreed resolution costs. She paused. There's also something else. Tell me. Marcus Del Rey. He's agreed to provide formal testimony in the arbitration, not just documents, deposition. His counsel called me this morning. Another pause. He said he watched the gala speech. He said, and I'm quoting, I should have come forward a year ago. Vivian was quiet for a moment. She thought about Marcus Del Rey, whom she'd met 3 times over the years at company events, a careful, quiet man in his mid-50s who had always struck her as someone who knew more than he said. Does he know what his testimony changes? Yes, Claire said. He knows. She sat with that. The meeting room she was in was a rented space. The Haven Initiative's permanent offices were still being fitted out, 2 floors of a building in the Caldwell district that would be ready in 6 weeks. And the temporary furniture was mismatched, and the window looked out on a parking structure, and it was about as far from the marble lobby of Vaughn Technologies as a room could be, and she was more comfortable in it than she had been in any of Adrian's spaces in 4 years. Claire, she said, yeah. Is it going to be enough, the testimony, the documents, the clause? Is it enough? Claire was quiet for exactly long enough that it wasn't a performance. For the arbitration, yes. For the divorce, more than enough. She paused again. For the other thing you're actually asking, whether it adds up to something that means it mattered. Her voice shifted slightly, lost the attorney register, became just Claire. You stood up in a ballroom with 200 people and you told the truth. 3 women called us this week because they heard you. One of them is in safe housing right now that she wasn't in last Thursday. A beat. I think it matters. Vivian looked at the parking structure through the window. A car was pulling into a space very slowly and then not quite fitting and having to back out and try again, which was the most human thing she'd seen all day. Okay, she said. Okay, Claire said. Get some sleep. I'll try. She ended the call and sat for a moment in the empty meeting room and let herself feel the full weight of the last 5 weeks. Not the legal pieces, not the financial pieces, not the public narrative, but the human weight of it, which was heavier and stranger and less organized than any of those things. She had walked out of a marriage she'd been in for 4 years. She was living in her father's house at 34. She was running an organization that was 8 days old. She was having a baby in 6 weeks, alone, in the sense that the person who was supposed to be there with her had turned out to be someone who had never actually been there at all. She was also, and this was the thing that kept surprising her, catching her off guard in quiet moments like this one, she was also more herself than she'd been in years. The self that had been compressed and managed and gradually quieted into compliance was loud again. Opinions she'd learned not to voice, preferences she'd learned to defer. The particular quality of her own attention, her own way of moving through problems, which Adrian had consistently reframed as stubbornness or difficulty, and which turned out, in an environment that didn't require her to apologize for it, to be the most useful thing about her. She was getting her life back. Not the version she'd had before Adrian. She was 34 and pregnant, and that version was gone, and she didn't want it back anyway. Something new. Built from what she actually was, rather than what had been useful for someone else's image. She put on her coat and picked up her bag and turned off the light in the meeting room and walked out into the hallway, where Rosario was still at her desk, on the phone, taking notes with the focused efficiency of someone who understood that the work didn't stop because the day did. Vivian stopped at the doorway. Go home, she said. Rosario looked up. 5 minutes. Rosario. 4 minutes. She went back to her notes. Vivian almost argued, then didn't. She recognized something in that posture. The specific version of this matters, and I'm not done that she'd seen in Claire 100 times and felt in herself tonight, in this parking structure-facing room, building something from the beginning. She walked out into the evening, one hand at her back, the city loud and indifferent around her, and she thought about her son, who would be here in 6 weeks, who would be born into whatever she managed to build between now and then and after, and she thought, it won't be perfect. None of it will be perfect. There would be hard days and bad decisions and things she would look back on and wish she'd done differently. The organization would make mistakes. The divorce would grind on. She would be tired in ways she couldn't fully anticipate yet. But she would be there, actually there, not performing presence while being somewhere else entirely. And her son would grow up watching a woman who, when faced with a choice between comfortable silence and costly truth, had chosen the truth and had built something from it. That was enough to keep walking. She hailed a cab and gave the address of her father's house and sat in the back with her hand on her stomach and watched the city pass. And the city was lit and loud and full of people who had no idea who she was, which was, she was finding, one of the better things about it. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Vivian almost didn't open it. It came in a cream envelope with Adrian's name in the upper left corner. Not his legal team's address, not the firm's letterhead, just his name handwritten in the careful, slightly angular script she'd spent 4 years watching signed documents and birthday cards and the occasional note left on the kitchen counter when he left early for meetings. She recognized the handwriting before she recognized the envelope, and she stood at her father's front door for a moment with the rest of the mail in one hand and this envelope in the other, and considered, genuinely, whether she wanted to know what was inside it. She was 5 weeks from her due date. Her back hurt constantly now. A deep, grinding complaint that no amount of careful positioning fully resolved. She slept in 2-hour increments and woke to the particular 3 a.m. silence of a house where she was the only one awake, and lay there thinking about logistics, the organization, the space they were moving into next week, the 3 women currently in transitional housing that the Haven Initiative had arranged, the pediatrician appointment on Thursday, the deposition summary Claire had sent at midnight that Vivian had read on her phone in the dark, and then set aside because there was nothing actionable in it before morning. She had a full life now, a genuinely full one, not the performed fullness of a marriage that required constant maintenance to look complete from outside. She had the Haven Initiative and her father's garden and the mismatched meeting room furniture and Rosario staying 4 minutes late every single night and Claire calling at the end of every day, sometimes all business and sometimes just talking because they were friends before they were anything else. And both of them were learning, slowly, to not let the work crowd that out entirely. She did not need the letter. She opened it anyway. It was 4 pages, handwritten on plain paper. Not legal paper, not correspondence stationery, plain white paper from a printer that he'd turned over and written on the back of. She noticed that detail. It meant he hadn't planned it, hadn't prepared, hadn't consulted anyone before writing it. It meant he'd sat down somewhere private with a pen and written it through without a strategy for how it would land. She read it standing in the doorway. She didn't go inside to sit. She just stood there and read. He wrote that he had spent the week since the gala in something he didn't have a precise word for. Not depression, he said, which came through as both honest and characteristically Adrian, his discomfort with imprecise language persisting even in apparent crisis. Something more like disorientation, the removal of a context in which he had known how to operate. He wrote that his attorneys had advised him not to contact her personally, and that he was disregarding that advice not because he disagreed with it professionally, but because there were things he needed to say that were separate from the legal proceeding, and that he had run out of time for separating things that were inconvenient from things that were true. He wrote that he knew he had treated her badly, that the birthday dinner had not been a momentary loss of control, but a visible expression of something that had been running underneath the surface of their marriage for years, a dynamic he had cultivated and defended and refused to examine because examining it would have required admitting things about himself that were incompatible with the version of himself he had decided was the real one. He wrote that he had spent years being certain he understood what mattered. That certainty, he wrote, had not survived contact with what the last 8 weeks had actually looked like. He wrote about their son, not strategically, or if it was strategic, it was the best writing he'd ever done, and she'd read enough of his professional correspondence to calibrate his range. He wrote about the son he hadn't met yet, and the way that fact had become, in the weeks since the gala, the weight he couldn't set down. He wrote that he understood now that his plan, The marriage as business asset, the managed exit, the efficient language she still couldn't read without a cold flare of anger, had always had a third element that he had not allowed himself to consciously examine. Not just Vivian, the child, who had also been a calculation, had also been factored in as an image component, a proof of stability, and who was, in the private reckoning he was apparently doing alone on whatever Tuesday this letter had been written, an actual human being who would grow up and understand things, eventually, and who deserved a father who had at some point managed to be honest about what he was. He did not ask for forgiveness. She noted that. He did not ask for a meeting, did not ask her to reconsider the divorce proceedings, did not frame any of it as a path back to anything they'd had. He said only, at the end of the 4th page, "I destroyed the only genuine relationship I was ever offered. I think I knew I was doing it and chose not to stop. That's the part I have to live with. I wanted you to know I know." She finished the letter and stood in the doorway for another moment and looked out at the garden. A bird was working at something near the far hedge, some industrious project she couldn't identify from distance. The morning was cool and pale and ordinary. She did not cry. She wasn't sure what she felt exactly. It wasn't satisfaction, wasn't relief, wasn't the reopening of anything she'd thought was closed. It was something smaller and harder to name, the recognition that even people who had done serious damage were somewhere underneath it, real and breakable and capable of understanding what they'd broken. That didn't change anything about the damage. It didn't change the birthday dinner, or the years preceding it, or the emails about efficient exits, or the letter sent through his attorney threatening to use her pregnancy as leverage. It didn't change the women who had called the Haven Initiative because they had watched the gala speech and felt something finally had a name. But it was true, and she'd been trying, in the months since all of this had begun, to be honest about what was true, even when what was true was complicated. She folded the letter along its original creases and took it inside and put it in the drawer of the desk in her room and went to make breakfast. She didn't respond to it. Not that day, not in the weeks that followed. His redemption, such as it was not her project. She had enough projects. Oliver Wren Mercer was born on a Thursday morning at 6:42 a.m. in the delivery room of St. Catherine's General, after 14 hours of labor that were exactly as difficult as everyone had told her they'd be, and slightly more unglamorous than she'd privately imagined. Claire was there for 12 of the 14 hours, which was more than Vivian had asked for and exactly what she'd needed. Claire in the corner of the room with terrible vending machine coffee and her laptop open because she was incapable of stopping work entirely, but present, actually present, in the way that mattered. Vivian's father arrived at the hospital at 4 a.m. and sat in the waiting room with his hands folded and his phone face down, which was, for Elliot Wren, the equivalent of vigil. The delivery was hard and loud and at no point resembled anything from a movie, and Vivian spent a significant portion of it holding a nurse's hand with a grip the nurse would later describe to her colleague as memorable. And when it was over and Oliver was placed on her chest, red-faced, furious, announcing his objection to the entire situation at considerable volume, she looked at him and felt something so large and disorganized that she didn't try to find words for it. She just held him. "He's angry," Claire said from the corner, standing now, laptop closed, taking up the position she'd been in for the last hour, which was essentially as close to the bed as the medical staff would permit. "Good," Vivian said. Her voice came out wrecked and unsteady, and she didn't care at all. "He should be. The world is a lot." "He's got your chin," Claire said. "He's got my father's eyes." "Heaven help us all," Claire said, which was the least appropriate thing to say, and made Vivian laugh painfully through everything else she was feeling. Her father came in 20 minutes later and stood at the bedside and looked at his grandson with an expression Vivian had not seen on his face before. Something unguarded, the careful composure entirely absent, replaced by something raw and older and considerably more human. "Elliot," she said. She almost never used his name. He looked at her. "He's okay," she said. "We're okay." Her father nodded once, the same way he'd nodded in the ballroom before she walked to the microphone, and then he sat down in the chair beside her and looked at his grandson and did not try to produce words for what he was feeling, which was perhaps the most they had ever understood each other without speaking. The settlement was finalized 6 weeks after Oliver was born. not a trial. A negotiated resolution, driven largely by the arbitration timeline, which had been moving in a direction Adrian's remaining legal team found increasingly untenable. The morality clause breach was formally established. The Meridian damages were settled at a number that was disclosed to the parties, but not the press, though the financial journalists estimated it accurately enough from the company's subsequent disclosures. Vivian received what she was entitled to: her fair share of the marital assets, child support established on a structure that Claire had negotiated with the patience of someone who understood that the details mattered more than the headline number, and the formal legal framework for Oliver's custody arrangement, which was documented in specific and left no room for the ambiguity that Adrian had historically preferred in situations where ambiguity served him. She signed the final documents at Claire's office on a Wednesday afternoon with Oliver asleep in his carrier on the conference table beside her. The room smelled of bad coffee and the dry, particular scent of legal paper. The pen Claire handed her was a cheap ballpoint, which felt entirely appropriate. She signed. "That's it," Claire said. Vivian looked at the documents for a moment. The weight of them. 4 years, all of it compressed into pages of language designed to be unambiguous, to leave no room for interpretation. She had lived for 4 years in a marriage full of room for interpretation, full of spaces where the meaning of things could be adjusted after the fact by the person with more power. There was a relief in the specificity of legal finality that she hadn't expected. "That's it," she said. She picked up Oliver's carrier carefully. He shifted but didn't wake, some internal gyroscope that newborns have for the particular motion of being lifted and carried, and walked out of Claire's office into the afternoon. The Haven Initiative moved into its permanent space that same month. 2 floors in a building 3 blocks from Claire's apartment, which was either coincidence or Claire's doing, and Vivian had decided not to ask. The offices were real offices now, not matching furniture, because the budget had gone to things that mattered more, but functional and warm, with actual art on the walls that 2 of the transitional housing residents had made, a fact that Vivian had insisted on when Rosario had suggested purchasing prints. The walls should have something real on them, she'd said. Rosario had looked at her with the expression she used when she agreed but wasn't going to say so directly, which Vivian had learned to read as endorsement. They had, by the end of the first 4 months, provided legal representation to 31 women, emergency housing to 19, financial counseling and rebuilding support to 24, some of whom overlapped with the other categories, and some of whom had found them through word of mouth and arrived already having left, already out, already in the grinding, practical aftermath of leaving, needing help rebuilding the material infrastructure of an independent life. That was a part of it Vivian hadn't fully anticipated when she and Claire had been working through the model. The number of women who had gotten themselves out but then found the outside harder to navigate than they'd expected, because the systems that were supposed to help were slow and bureaucratic and assumed a baseline of stability that women leaving abusive situations often didn't have. She thought about that a lot. She thought about the woman who had called the week after the gala, the first call, the one Claire had taken. Her name was Denise, and she was 3 months into her own process now, her children in a school near the transitional housing, herself working part-time while the legal situation was sorted. She was not okay, exactly. She was in the middle of things, which was a harder place to be than either the beginning or the end, and she had good days and bad ones, and the bad ones were sometimes very bad. But she was out. She was in the actual process of rebuilding a life rather than surviving inside a situation that would eventually have consumed whatever was left of her. Vivian thought about what it had taken to get there. The gala speech, yes. The documentation and the lawyers and her father in the back of the room. But before any of that, the 11 days of performance, of passing the salt and asking about meetings, of carrying what she was carrying and not letting any of it show on her face. The night in Claire's kitchen at 11 o'clock with the bad tea and the good lawyer and the decision to not do this quietly. The drive to her father's house on a gravel road that he wouldn't pave. The moment of understanding, standing in an elevator with frosting in her hair, that she was not going to absorb this one the way she had absorbed all the others. The moment of deciding to stop. She had spoken publicly a handful of times since the gala. Not a media strategy, not a campaign, just invitations she'd accepted when they came from places that seemed real and specific rather than opportunistic. A legal conference on domestic abuse documentation, a panel on organizational models for women's support services. Once, a smaller event, a community meeting in the south side of the city, 40 people in a church hall with folding chairs and a microphone on a stand, and the woman who had introduced her had stood up and said simply, "She did the thing that most of us think we can't do. I want her to tell you how she did it," and sat back down. Vivian had stood at the microphone and thought about what to say and had uncharacteristically skipped the prepared version. "I didn't do it because I was brave," she'd said. "I want to be clear about that because I think that framing lets everyone off the hook, including me. Courage is a story we tell after the fact. In the moment, I did it because I had run out of the energy it takes to keep absorbing something that is wrong. I did it because I had a very good lawyer and a father who showed up and a friend who stayed in a hospital room for 14 hours and brought terrible coffee." She'd paused. "The support matters. The people who show up matter. Nobody does the hard thing alone. And the systems that are supposed to make it possible for people to do the hard thing, the legal systems, the financial systems, the housing systems, are not good enough. That's what we're trying to fix. Not because we had a dramatic gala moment, because Denise called, and we were there to answer." She hadn't expected the room to be so quiet after that. She hadn't expected the woman in the third row, mid-50s, practical clothes, the specific look of someone who had been somewhere hard and come back, to put her hand up slowly and say, "I called 3 places before yours. Nobody answered." Vivian had held that woman's eye contact and said, "I know, we're trying to change that." And the inadequacy of saying that, the distance between trying and done, had sat in her chest for the rest of the evening and most of the drive home, and not entirely left in the days after. That was the part that didn't resolve neatly. The part she'd had to make her peace with, or not peace exactly, more like a working relationship. The fact that what she was doing was real and necessary, and nowhere near enough all at the same time. The organization was 4 months old, it was 8 months old, it was a year old, and had helped 104 women and turned away cases it didn't have the capacity for, and hired a second attorney and outgrown the 2 floors, and was looking at a third and still turned away cases. The need was not something that scaled with the response. The need was enormous and ongoing and older than any of them. And what the Haven Initiative was doing was real and finite and imperfect, and she had to decide daily that the finite, imperfect, real thing was worth doing anyway. She decided that every day. Some days it was easier than others. Oliver was 8 months old the afternoon she sat in the main office, a couch she'd put in the corner specifically for this purpose, a low, worn thing that had belonged to Claire's old apartment and that Claire had given her when she upgraded. The kind of furniture that looked like it had been lived in because it had, nursing him with one hand and reviewing a funding proposal with the other, while Rosario walked through the outer office talking on the phone in the particular rapid, decisive tone that meant she was handling something that was technically above the scope of her role and had been doing so for 20 minutes. It was an ordinary Tuesday. It was the kind of day the organization ran on. Not dramatic, not the gala, or the speech, or the first call, or the night in Claire's kitchen. Just the work. Again. The way it had to be done again every day. The accumulated weight of 100 small decisions that together amounted to something larger than any single one. Her phone buzzed on the cushion beside her. A message from her father. "Board proposal looks solid. Call me when you can." She smiled at that. Elliot Wren had joined the organization's advisory board with the specific understanding, negotiated over 2 breakfasts, that he would not be visible in its public-facing work. He had given her his reach and his resources and kept his name off the website because she'd asked him to, because this was hers, because the whole point was that it was something she had built from the capacity she actually had, rather than the capacity she had borrowed. He had respected that in the same way he'd respected everything she'd asked of him through all of this. Without editorializing, without the particular tendency some fathers have of giving you what you asked for while simultaneously making clear they know better. She texted back, "Tonight." 7. Oliver made a sound of contentment or complaint. At 8 months, she still could not always tell which. And she looked down at him, and he looked back with her father's eyes and her own stubbornness visible in the line of his jaw even at this age, some genetic insistence already expressing itself in the way he regarded the world, as if he was already taking notes. "What?" she said to him. He said something back in the language of 8-month-olds, which was emphatic and entirely unintelligible and clearly very important. "Fair enough," she said. She thought about Adrian's letter sometimes. Not often. Less than she expected, which told her something. She had put it in a drawer and left it there, not destroyed, not displayed, just set aside. It was a true document as far as she could assess, and she had decided that true things deserved to exist somewhere, even when they had no useful function. The function of the letter was not for her. His accounting of himself was his to do, his to carry, his to determine what to build from. She had her own accounting. What she had come to believe in the year since the ballroom was something she'd been reluctant to name while she was still inside the process of it. She believed that the version of herself she had been inside that marriage, the careful, managed, perpetually self-editing version who had learned to make herself small in the ways that were useful and visible in the ways that were useful, that version had not been a corruption of who she was. It had been a response, an adaptation, a person learning to survive a specific environment, doing what people do, which is adjust. The mistake had not been in adapting. The mistake had been in staying so long inside the adaptation that she'd started to believe it was the whole of her. She did not think she was beyond making that mistake again. She was 35, not 71, and she did not have her father's particular certainty that he understood the shape of his own life. She might love someone wrong again. She might build something and build it badly. She might miss things she should have seen, misread people who would cost her time she could not recover. She had no particular immunity to any of that, and she'd stopped trying to construct one. What she had was this: a year's worth of evidence that when she chose truth over comfort, things that were supposed to collapse did collapse, and things that were supposed to hold did hold. And what was left, in the clearing, was real. It was less beautiful than the constructed version had been. It was heavier in some places and considerably lighter in others. It was hers in a way that the marriage, the ballroom, the floral arrangements, and the lobby, and the 4 years of practiced grace had never been. She had Oliver, who was opinionated about everything and afraid of the vacuum cleaner, and had learned to pull himself to standing by gripping the edge of the coffee table, and who looked at her sometimes with an expression of such uncomplicated certainty that she was the person he needed that it made her throat tight in a way she'd stopped trying to manage or explain. She had Claire, who was currently drafting legislation, an actual bill, in partnership with a state representative who had found her after reading coverage of the Haven Initiative, that would require domestic abuse documentation to be accepted in civil proceedings in ways that current law complicated unnecessarily. It was slow and would probably be slower. Claire found the slowness enraging and was doing it anyway, which was the most Claire thing Vivian had ever watched her do. She had her father, who had called her last week at 7 in the morning to tell her there was a frost advisory, and she should cover the tomatoes she'd planted in the section of his garden she'd claimed as her own, which was the most his way of saying, "I am glad you are here," that she could have hoped for. She had 104 women, and the ones who came after them, and the ones after that. She had a Tuesday, an ordinary, necessary, insufficient, real Tuesday. Rosario appeared in the doorway. "The Henderson intake is in 10 minutes, and you have a call from the state rep's office at 3. "I know." And Oliver has something on his chin that I think is, "I know about that too." Rosario looked at her with the expression that had replaced the one Vivian had first mistaken for skepticism. Something warmer, still direct, still the face of someone who had been doing hard work for a long time and was not interested in being managed or praised, but had decided, sometime in the last months, that this was a place worth staying. She went back to her desk. Vivian looked down at her son. There was a woman she'd read about years ago. She couldn't remember the name, some book she'd moved through quickly, one of the thousands of things absorbed and partially retained over a reading life, who had said something she'd found irritating at the time and had thought about many times since. The woman had said that the things we build after destruction are not replacements for what was lost, but evidence of what was always there, waiting to be used correctly. She had found that irritating when she was 28 and newly in love and convinced that the life she was building with Adrian Vaughn was the destination rather than the rehearsal. She found it less irritating now. She thought about the woman in the third row with her hand up. I called 3 places before yours. Nobody answered. She thought about the 11 days of performance, the cream envelope in the drawer, the frosting drying in her hair, the elevator doors closing. She thought about her father standing at the back of a ballroom with his hands at his sides, ready to be seen when being seen cost him something. She thought about Claire in a hospital room with terrible coffee and a laptop she was barely looking at because she was there, actually there, which was the whole of it. She thought about Oliver, who was watching her with her father's eyes, waiting for whatever came next. The woman who had stood at that charity gala microphone with 200 people watching and said the true thing had not been fearless. She had been afraid and said it anyway, which is a different thing entirely, and a more useful one. Fearlessness is the absence of something. Courage is the presence of something else, something harder to name. The willingness to let what matters to you be seen, to stop protecting yourself from the cost of being honest, to trust that what is real will hold when the constructed version falls. What is real holds. Not always in the ways you predict, not cleanly, not without cost, not on a timeline that respects your exhaustion or your grief or your 8-month-old sleep schedule, but it holds. She had a meeting in 10 minutes. She had a son on her lap and a lawyer drafting a bill and a woman in the third row who had called 3 places before anyone answered, and an organization that was going to answer the next call. She shifted Oliver to her shoulder and stood up and picked up her notes for the Henderson intake and walked out of the corner with the worn couch into the office where the work was. And the work was hard and real and nowhere near finished, and that was the whole point of it, and she was exactly where she was supposed to be.